Hi guys, so this week's theme is identity. Some of the big things you should be thinking about is that identity is our own self-concept about who we think that we are, but that we don't have a single identity. We always have multiple identities at any time. So identity is actually created through communication because we are exchanging messages with other people, displaying our identity, determining what other people's identities are through how they send messages to us, but that sometimes different identities are highlighted at different times. So for example, if you're talking to your grandmother, maybe your age identity is more prevalent than if you're talking to a classmate, or if you are talking to someone who also is involved in a sport that you're involved in, your athlete activity is activated, and maybe it wouldn't be in a classroom. Also, looking at different cultural ways that identity is formed. So in the US, young people are generally encouraged to be very independent from a very early age, whereas in other societies, young people are much more intertwined with their families. So in a lot of cultures, it's considered very normal for people to grow up in their household and not leave until they're married. Or perhaps once they're married, they live with either the husband or wife's family. It's very common across the world, and people from those cultures might think it's strange that in the US, young people tend to go and live out on their own before getting married, if they get married at all. And then people generally don't live with extended families. And so talking about a couple different types of identities, gender identity, and this difference between gender and biological sex. So gender is the degree of masculinity or femininity that's communicated, not sex as in what you were born with. And the ways that people enact gender really vary by culture. Sexual identity is different than gender identity. And sexual identity is more about the way that sexual desires interact with people's identities and their attractions that they feel. Age identity, I mentioned earlier, is about how people feel as opposed to other people in different age groups. And so a really interesting example, I think, is when you were in high school, the difference between a freshman and a senior is huge, right? Or even within college, there's a big difference. But a freshman and a senior in high school, it's just such a big deal. But if you think about it, I don't know, once that freshman and senior are 41 and 44, is there really that big of a difference at that point? No. And so at different stages in life, age categories matter more. Racial identity is based in some degree on physical characteristics because you're communicating your racial identity by the way people are judging you based on what they perceive to be your racial identity. And as you read in the book, there's a long history about what racial identity means and categories. And today, certainly, it's much more fluid than it was in the past and how people think about racial categories. Ethnic identity is identifying with a particular ethnic group or culture or not. And there was the set of information about hyphenated Americans and people that feel that they are both Mexican and American, Japanese and American. And what being Japanese American means to one person might mean something quite different to someone else. And so this idea about what is racial and what is ethnic identity is really interesting in talking about what is the difference between the two. And so think about that a little bit as you're prepping. Like, what do these differences really mean to you? And what do they mean when people are enacting racial versus ethnic identities? Another topic was talking about physical abilities and that about 15% of the population has at least one physical disability, which is a pretty high proportion, considering that these are ones that you're able to see. And so it was interesting to talk about that as another category. I hope that was an interesting set for you. Religious identity as well, that for many people, their religious identification is a big part of who they are. And that it overlaps sometimes with racial and ethnic identity. So for example, a Korean American might go to a Korean church, and you would say, okay, well, that's being religious, but that person might be motivated to go there to go and be with other Koreans. So it gets really complicated. And then class identity, at least in the US, thinking about social class as part of your identity, it's not so prevalent. For example, in England, there are very visible class differences in the way that people talk, the kind of jobs that people hold, whereas in the US, it's a little bit fuzzier. But regardless, the foods that people eat, the TV shows that people watch, there are a lot of markers of class identity that exist in the US. And the way that people from different classes are portrayed on TV, for example, has a really big impact on how people think about class identity. And then national identity is talking about the national identity, the passport that you carry, for example. And our national identity is the way that we can look at the rest of the world and say, well, I'm an American and those people are this. And that sometimes this national identity only gets enacted when something happens. So for example, September 11th, people felt much more American at that point. Or if people travel abroad, they feel much more American than they did if they were sitting in the United States. Regional identity is really interesting. People that highly identify with a particular region, so Southerners, for example, or New Englanders. And within the U.S., regional identities are really important. This is something that a lot of times people that don't live in the U.S. Or don't really know a lot about the U.S. don't understand, that there are major differences between Midwesterners and West Coast people, for example, or even within a state. So for example, in California, there's a large Southern California versus Northern California divide, and they have different slang, different attitudes about life. And so it's really interesting to think about those, and if people can or cannot shed their regional identity. So if you are a Southerner, are you a Southerner for life? Or if you move to Chicago tomorrow, would you be able to shed some of your Southern regional identity? And then finally, talking about personal identity. Each person has a personal identity and about who we think we are and what we think about ourselves, and the way that we communicate what we are and how we perceive ourselves to others. Now, in terms of identity development, what's interesting is to think about how minority group members tend to have a stronger sense of personal identity because they're in the minority. If you're not the majority culture, you're being forced to confront your identity on a daily basis, possibly. And so we talked about these stages that people go through in formulating an identity. So the first stage is unexamined identity, and this is when people aren't really thinking about their ethnic background. So they, a minority group might accept the values of the majority group. They might try to assimilate, and the ideas about identity are influenced by a variety of different groups: family, friends, work, media. The second stage is conformity, and this is when an individual would really internalize the values of a dominant group, and possibly even having negative attitudes about their own group. And then often the third stage is resistance and separatism. So when people it might be triggered by a bad event. So if someone is teased about their ethnicity, for example, and they're forced to confront the idea that maybe they aren't assimilating as well as they thought. And so this might motivate people to get into their ethnic identity again and really think about it. And then finally, integration. And this is what the authors of the book call the ideal outcome. So thinking about people being able to have a strong sense of their own identity while also adopting some of the traits of the dominant culture and mixing them together so that they can really feel comfortable with who they are in living sort of in two different worlds. Now, so that's when there's a minority group. If one's in the majority group, so let's say, for example, that you're entering a workforce and you yourself are, and it's a workforce that is made up of Japanese Americans. You yourself are Japanese American, and so your assimilation process is going to be majority identity development, whereas if you were coming in and you were someone from a different culture, it would be more in the minority development. So the first stage in the majority development is unexamined identity. So this is the same as the first stage in the minority development, and that people don't have an awareness that differences exist. The second stage is there's acceptance. So people realize that there are inequalities in society, and they start realizing, oh, there's a difference. I'm the majority, and there are some privileges that I have because I'm in the majority. The third stage is resistance, and realizing that these differences that exist between groups in society might not be the fault of those in the minority, but really that there's a societal-wide problem, and that people might think about, there might be something I can do about this. And then the fourth stage is redefinition and reintegration, and realizing that one can be in the majority but does not have to necessarily put other people down just because they're in the majority. And then there was a section about multicultural identity, people that are from mixed races and how they navigate the different identities that they have. We also had a couple interesting cases about people that grow up outside the US and how they adapt, and that was really interesting, or people that feel like they have gone beyond racial identity. So that was really interesting. In terms of talking about identity and intercultural communication, how do people convey their identities to other people? Well, one way is through core symbols. So symbols that indicate beliefs or central concepts of a particular identity. So flags, for example, or an emblem. Secondly, there's labels that people use to identify their identities. Let's say, I am Latina, or I'm Chicano. And then there's behavioral norms that are associated with particular identities, which may or may not be actually as prevalent as stereotypes would have you believe, but that there's things that are part of being a member of that group. And so the way that this intersects with the way that people are conveying their identity is really important. Okay, your online assignment this week is to post about culture shock. So if you've experienced it yourself, you can post about your own experience. And if you haven't, talk about what you read in the book. Your 2-page assignment, you need to watch the film A Class Divided and respond to it. Take a look in the document to see what you need to do.